The autumn auction at Cedar Creek's courthouse square drew desperate souls like honey draws flies, and Billy Harkins knew he belonged among them as he dismounted his weathered gelding in the crisp October dawn. 15 years of carrying stolen gold had carved lines deep as furrows in his weathered face, and the leather saddlebag slung over his shoulder felt heavier than the burden of guilt that had driven him back to this frontier town where his sins had taken root. Sheriff Madeline Colby watched from her office window as the stranger tied his horse to the hitching post with movements that spoke of bone-deep weariness. Something in his bearing caught her attention, the way he held himself like a man walking toward judgment, yet determined to see it through. She'd been sheriff of Cedar Creek for 8 years now, long enough to recognize the look of someone whose past had finally caught up with him. The courthouse square buzzed with the nervous energy of families facing financial ruin. Widow Abernathy clutched her late husband's pocket watch, her last valuable possession before the bank claimed her homestead. Young Tom Miller held the deed to his father's plow, knowing that selling it meant another winter of back-breaking labor with hand tools. These were her people now, Madeline thought, the ones she'd sworn to protect from predators both human and circumstantial. Billy paused outside the sheriff's office, his calloused hand gripping the saddlebag strap until his knuckles went white. The building looked different than he remembered. Fresh paint covering what had once been weathered boards, new shutters framing windows that sparkled clean in the morning light. Time had been kinder to Cedar Creek than it had been to him. Through the glass, he could see a woman behind the desk, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her star-shaped badge catching the light as she bent over legal documents. This wasn't the sheriff he remembered. Old Sheriff Morrison had been a hard man with harder fists, the kind who settled disputes with a club and asked questions later. This woman looked different entirely, her posture suggesting competence rather than cruelty. The door opened with a soft chime, a small bell announcing his arrival. Sheriff Colby looked up from her paperwork, her gray eyes taking in his appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to measuring threats and intentions. She saw a man in his 40s, lean from years of hard living, with crow's feet earned from squinting against desert sun and the kind of stillness that came from carrying heavy secrets. "Morning," she said, setting down her pen with deliberate care. "Something I can help you with?" Billy removed his hat, revealing hair prematurely silver at the temples. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the saddlebag on her desk, the leather making a soft thud that seemed to echo in the quiet office. The weight of it sat between them like an accusation waiting to be voiced. "My name's Billy Harkins," he said, his voice roughened by years of keeping his own counsel. 15 years ago, I took something from this town. Something that wasn't mine to take." He gestured toward the bag. "I've come to give it back." Madeline's eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion but with curiosity. She'd heard the name Harkins before, whispered in conversations that stopped when she entered a room, mentioned in old wanted posters she'd found filed away in the back of Morrison's desk when she'd taken over the position. The Harkins gang had been notorious in these parts, known for hitting banks and gold shipments with a precision that had frustrated lawmen across 3 territories. "That's a mighty old debt to be settling," she said, making no move to open the bag. "What brings you back now?" Billy's throat worked as he swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing beneath skin weathered to leather by sun and wind. "Had a daughter," he said quietly. "She'd be about the age of that little girl I see walking to school each morning. Same blonde curls, same way of skipping when she's happy." His voice caught. "Lost her to the fever 2 winters back, along with her mother. Made me think about the kind of man I want to be remembered as." The admission hung in the air between them like morning mist, heavy with the weight of grief and regret. Madeline found herself studying his face, noting the deep lines carved by sorrow, the way his shoulders curved inward as if protecting something precious and already broken. She'd seen enough grief in her years as sheriff to recognize the genuine article when it stood before her. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, and meant it. "But I have to ask, why not just disappear? Why come back here where folks might recognize you, might want to see you hang?" Billy's laugh was bitter as autumn wind. "Tried that for years. Every town I rode through, every job I took, that gold was like a weight around my neck. Couldn't spend it, couldn't throw it away, couldn't forget where it came from or what it cost the people of this town." He gestured toward the window where they could see people preparing for the auction. "Some debts can't be outrun, Sheriff. They follow you like shadows, getting longer as the sun sets on your life." Madeline stood and walked to the window, her boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. Outside, she could see Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry behind her boarding house, the white sheets snapping in the breeze like flags of surrender. Mr. Patterson was opening his general store, the bell above his door jangling as he propped it wide to catch the morning customers. These were her people now, the ones she'd sworn to protect and serve, and they deserved to know the truth about the man who'd brought stolen gold back to their community. "The Harkins gang hit the bank on October 15, 1872, she said without turning around. "Took $12,000 in gold, shot 2 men, and rode out of town like the devil himself was chasing them. One of those men was Jacob Morrison, the bank clerk. Other was Doc Henley, who was making a deposit." She turned to face him. "Doc Henley died from his wounds 3 days later. Jacob Morrison lived, but his arm never healed right. Can't work like he used to." Billy's face went pale beneath his tan. "I remember," he said hoarsely. "I remember both of them. The doc was trying to help the clerk when—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I ain't proud of what we did that day. Wasn't supposed to be anyone in the bank but the teller. Things went wrong fast, real fast." "Things have a way of doing that when you point guns at people," Madeline said, her voice level but not unkind. "The question now is what we do about it. That money you're carrying, assuming it's what you say it is, won't bring Doc Henley back. Won't fix Jacob Morrison's arm or give him back his livelihood." "I know that," Billy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's all I got to give. That and the truth about what happened that day, if it matters to anyone after all these years." Madeline returned to her desk and sat down, her fingers drumming thoughtfully on the worn wood. The morning light streaming through the window caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making them look like tiny spirits hovering between past and present. She'd dealt with plenty of criminals in her time as sheriff, but never one who'd returned voluntarily to face justice for crimes committed before she'd even arrived in Cedar Creek. "Open the bag," she said finally. Billy's hands shook as he worked the leather straps, his fingers fumbling with knots that had remained tied for 15 years. When the bag finally opened, the morning light caught the gold inside, sending bright reflections dancing across the office walls. Coins and small bars lay nestled together, each piece polished to a dull gleam by years of careful handling and guilty conscience. Madeline leaned forward, her experienced eye taking inventory. She'd seen enough gold shipments and bank deposits to recognize the real thing, and this was genuine frontier currency. Double eagles, half eagles, and gold bars stamped with territorial mint marks. "Looks like most of it's here," she said. "Maybe all of it, from what I can tell from the old reports." "Every piece," Billy confirmed. "Never spent so much as a single coin. Couldn't bring myself to profit from what we'd done. Not when I knew the cost in blood and suffering." "Then how'd you live? How'd you support your family?" Billy's smile was sad and proud at the same time. "Honest work. Ranch hand, mostly. Some carpentry when I could get it. Built barns and houses, fixed fences, broke horses. My wife, she was a seamstress, took in mending and made clothes for the church ladies." His voice softened. "We didn't have much, but we had each other, and we had clean consciences about how we earned our bread." "Well, she did. I carried the weight of this secret every day we were together. And she never knew? About your past, about what you'd done? Billy shook his head. Thought I was just another drifter looking for a fresh start. Met her in Kansas, 3 years after the robbery. She was working in a dry goods store, prettiest thing I'd ever seen, with a laugh that could make you forget your troubles. I knew from the first time I saw her that I wanted to be worthy of a woman like that. Madeline could hear the pain in his voice, the regret of a man who'd built a life on a foundation of hidden truth. What changed? Why come back now? Little Mary, my daughter, she got sick first. Fever took hold of her and wouldn't let go. I sat by her bedside for 3 days, watching her waste away, and all I could think about was how I'd never told her who her daddy really was. Not the man who loved her and taught her to ride and read her stories at bedtime, but the man who'd robbed banks and killed people. Billy's voice cracked. She died not knowing the truth about me, and maybe that was a mercy. But when my wife followed her a week later, I knew I couldn't go on carrying this burden alone. So you came back. Took me 2 years to work up the courage. Kept telling myself I was being foolish, that there was nothing to be gained by dredging up old pain. But every night I'd dream about that bank robbery, about the look in Doc Henley's eyes when the bullet took him, about Jacob Morrison crying out as his arm shattered. The dead don't rest easy when their killers walk free, Sheriff. Neither do the living who carry their blood on their hands. Madeline closed the bag carefully, her mind working through the implications of what was happening in her office. The law was clear about theft and bank robbery, but the circumstances were anything but typical. A man returning stolen goods after 15 years, seeking not escape but justice, presenting himself voluntarily for arrest and prosecution. It wasn't something covered in any manual she'd ever read. Billy Harkins, she said formally, I'm placing you under arrest for bank robbery, theft, and conspiracy in the death of Dr. Marcus Henley. Billy nodded, standing slowly and turning around to present his hands for the shackles. I understand, Sheriff. I'm ready to face whatever consequences the law demands. But Madeline didn't reach for her handcuffs. Instead, she stood and walked to the window again, looking out at the town that had grown and prospered despite the tragedy that had struck it 15 years ago. The auction was beginning in the courthouse square, families gathering with their precious possessions, hoping to raise enough money to survive another winter on the frontier. What you did was wrong, she said without turning around. People died because of your actions. Lives were changed forever. Families destroyed. That can't be undone, no matter how much gold you bring back or how many years you spend regretting it. I know, Billy said quietly. But, Madeline continued, turning to face him, you also made a choice 15 years ago to live differently, to work honestly, to build a family, to be a better man than the one who rode with that gang. That counts for something too, though I'm not sure what yet. Billy looked up at her, confusion and hope warring in his weathered features. What are you saying, Sheriff? Madeline walked back to her desk and sat down, her hands folded over the saddlebag. I'm saying that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about making things right in whatever way we can. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The people of this town have been living with the consequences of that robbery for 15 years. Jacob Morrison's been struggling to make ends meet ever since his injury ended his banking career. Eleanor Henley's been raising 2 children alone, fighting to keep the small farm her husband left her. There are families here who suffered because of what you and your gang did. I want to help them, Billy said eagerly. However I can. The gold's just the beginning. I got skills, I can work, I can. Madeline held up a hand, stopping him. Hold on now. I'm not saying I'm just going to let you walk away. What I'm saying is that maybe there's a different kind of justice we can arrange. Something that serves the people of this town better than just locking you up and throwing away the key. Billy's eyes widened. You mean you'd consider? I mean I want to think about this. Talk to some people. See what the town thinks about having you here, working to make amends instead of just sitting in a cell eating food the taxpayers have to provide. Madeline leaned back in her chair. You got somewhere to stay while I sort this out? Billy shook his head. Rode in this morning. Figured I'd either be sleeping in your jail, or... He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he meant. Many frontier towns still believed in rope justice for bank robbers, especially ones who'd killed respected members of the community. Well, the jail's still an option, Madeline said dryly. But I'm thinking maybe Mrs. Henderson's boarding house might be more comfortable. She takes in drifters sometimes, and she could use the help around the place since her husband passed last spring. You'd trust me to stay at a boarding house? Without guards or chains? Madeline studied his face for a long moment, taking in the genuine surprise and gratitude she saw there. Billy, if you were planning to run, you wouldn't have come here in the first place. A man who carries guilt for 15 years and then rides back to face it isn't likely to rabbit at the first opportunity. Billy nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a current. What do I tell people? About who I am, why I'm here. For now. You tell them you're Billy Harkins, and you're looking for work while you get your affairs settled. The truth will come out eventually, it always does in a town this size, but let me talk to some folks first. Figure out how to handle this without causing a panic or a lynching. Madeline stood and walked to the door, opening it to let in the fresh autumn air. The scent of apple pies cooling on windowsills mixed with the smell of burning leaves, creating the distinctive perfume of a frontier town preparing for winter. In the distance, she could hear the auctioneer's voice calling out bids on the courthouse steps, families trading their treasures for survival. Mrs. Henderson's place is 3 doors down, she said, pointing toward a large white house with blue shutters. Tell her I sent you and that you're looking for a room and willing to work for part of your keep. She'll put you to work splitting wood or mending fences, honest labor that might help you sleep better at night. Billy picked up his hat and settled it on his head, then paused at the doorway. Sheriff, why are you doing this? Giving me a chance instead of just locking me up like any sensible lawman would? Madeline considered the question, her gray eyes thoughtful. Because I've learned that sometimes the law and justice aren't exactly the same thing. The law says I should arrest you, and I will if I have to. But justice might be better served by giving you the chance to earn redemption instead of just punishment. Billy's voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. Thank you, ma'am. I won't disappoint you. Don't thank me yet, Madeline warned. This town's been nursing old wounds for 15 years. Some folks might not be as willing to consider alternatives as I am. You might find yourself wishing you were safe in a cell before this is all over. After Billy left, Madeline sat alone in her office, the saddlebag of gold heavy on her desk like a physical manifestation of the moral weight she now carried. Through her window, she could see him walking toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, his shoulders straight despite the burden he'd carried for so long. The autumn sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full scope of the day's challenges. She opened the bag again, letting the gold coins run through her fingers like water. $12,000 was a fortune to a town like Cedar Creek, enough to make real differences in people's lives. Jacob Morrison could finally get proper medical care for his damaged arm, maybe even travel to Denver to see one of those specialist doctors. Eleanor Henley could fix her farmhouse roof and buy winter coats for her children. The school could get new books and supplies. The church could repair its leaking roof before winter set in hard. But first, she had to figure out how to tell a town full of people that the man responsible for their greatest tragedy had returned, not as a fugitive but as a penitent seeking redemption. Some would call for his head, demanding the justice they'd been denied for 15 years. Others might see the opportunity for healing, for closing old wounds in a way that benefited everyone. Madeline locked the gold in her office safe, the heavy door swinging shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the building. Then she reached for her hat and coat. It was time to pay some visits, to test the waters and see how deep the currents of forgiveness might run in Cedar Creek. The first stop would be Jacob Morrison himself, now running a small tobacco shop on the edge of town, his injured arm limiting him to light work but his mind still sharp as the day he'd tried to stop a bank robbery with nothing but courage and determination. If anyone had the right to demand Billy Harkins's head, it was Jacob Morrison. But as Madeline stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she found herself hoping that 15 years of living with the consequences might have taught them all something about the difference between revenge and justice, between punishment and redemption. The gold was just the beginning. The real test would be whether a town could find the courage to forgive, and whether a man could find the strength to earn that forgiveness through more than just good intentions and returned treasure. The wind picked up as she walked down Main Street, scattering leaves across her path like scattered pieces of the past, each one a reminder that some things could be swept away while others remained, rooted deep and permanent as the oak trees that lined the street. Billy Harkins had returned to Cedar Creek carrying more than gold in his saddlebag. He'd brought with him the possibility of healing, and the risk of reopening wounds that had never quite healed properly. Time would tell which way the balance would tip, but Madeline knew that whatever happened next would define not just Billy's fate, but the character of the entire community. In the distance, she could hear the auctioneer's voice growing more urgent as the morning wore on, families bidding their last dollars on their neighbors' possessions, the cycle of frontier desperation and survival playing out as it had for generations. Soon, she thought, they'd have to decide what kind of justice they wanted to be remembered for. The conversation at Jacob Morrison's tobacco shop didn't go as Madeline had expected. When she pushed through the door, the bell overhead announcing her arrival with a cheerful jangle that seemed oddly inappropriate for the gravity of her mission. She found Jacob behind the counter sorting pipe tobacco with his good hand while his damaged arm hung useless at his side. He looked up when she entered, his weathered face creasing into the kind of smile reserved for old friends. At 53, Jacob had the lean build of a man who'd learned to work with what remained after tragedy took its toll. His graying hair was neatly combed, his shirt pressed despite being mended in several places, and his eyes held the quiet dignity of someone who'd refused to let bitterness consume what was left of his life. "Afternoon, Sheriff. What brings you by? Don't tell me you've taken up smoking." Madeline removed her hat and held it in both hands, a gesture Jacob recognized immediately as the prelude to serious conversation. They'd known each other for 8 years now, ever since she'd arrived in Cedar Creek with her own past to escape and her own wounds to heal. He'd been one of the first to welcome her, understanding perhaps better than most what it meant to start over in a place that offered second chances. "Jacob, I need to tell you something that's going to be hard to hear," she began, then stopped, searching for words that might soften the blow. "There weren't any. Billy Harkins rode into town this morning." The smile faded from Jacob's face like morning mist burning off in the sun. His good hand stilled on the tobacco, and she saw the color drain from his cheeks until his face looked like parchment. The name hung between them like a curse made flesh, carrying with it the weight of 15 years' worth of pain and unanswered questions. "Billy Harkins," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Harkins gang." "He came to turn himself in," Madeline said quickly, wanting to get the full truth out before shock could turn to rage. "Brought back all the gold from the bank robbery. Every piece of it, from what I can tell. Says he's been carrying the guilt for 15 years and wants to make things right." Jacob's laugh was bitter as chicory coffee, a sound that held no humor but plenty of pain. "Make things right." He held up his damaged arm, the fingers twisted and stiff from the bullet that had shattered the bone. "How's he planning to do that, Sheriff? Got some miracle cure for old bullet wounds? Can he bring Doc Henley back from the grave?" "No," Madeline said simply. "He can't do any of that. But he can try to help the people who are still suffering because of what he did. That's what he's asking for, the chance to make amends through his actions, not just his words." Jacob turned away from her, walking to the window that looked out on Main Street. The autumn light filtering through the glass cast shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. Outside, life continued its steady rhythm, Mrs. Patterson sweeping her front steps, children walking home from school with their primers and slates, the ordinary business of a frontier town that had learned to heal around its wounds. "I see him every morning," Jacob said quietly. "In my dreams, I mean. That young man with the desperate eyes who walked into the bank that day. Just a kid, really, couldn't have been more than 25. Had his face covered with a bandana, but I could see his eyes above it. Scared eyes, like he was as surprised as anyone to be holding that gun." Madeline waited, understanding that sometimes the most important conversations happened in silence, in the spaces between words where truth lived and grew. I used to hate him, Jacob continued, his voice gaining strength. All of them, but especially him. The others were just faces behind bandanas, but I looked right into his eyes when he shot me. Saw the fear there, the way his hand was shaking when he pulled that trigger. I told myself for years that if I ever saw him again, I'd kill him with my bare hands. And now, Jacob's shoulders shook slightly, and Madeline realized he was crying. Not the dramatic sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of a man who'd carried pain for so long it had become part of him, like the ache in his damaged arm that never quite went away. But the hate was eating me alive, he said, wiping his eyes with his good hand. My Sarah tried to tell me, God rest her soul. My wife, she'd say, Jacob, that anger's going to kill you sure as that bullet did. And she was right. I was so busy being angry at Billy Harkins that I forgot how to be grateful for what I still had. He turned back to face Madeline, his eyes red but clear. Where is he now? Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. I told him to get a room and wait while I talked to some folks, figured out how the town feels about this. Jacob nodded slowly, his good hand unconsciously massaging his damaged arm in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. And how do you feel about it, Sheriff? You're the law here. What's your inclination? Madeline had been dreading this question, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wasn't sure she could explain it in a way that made sense to anyone else. I think, she said carefully, that sometimes the Lord sends us opportunities to heal wounds we didn't know we could heal. That maybe Billy Harkins coming back isn't just about him seeking forgiveness, but about all of us finding a way to let go of the past and build something better. That's a mighty Christian way of looking at it, Jacob said, and Madeline couldn't tell if he meant it as a compliment or criticism. My daddy was a preacher, she replied. Some things stick with you, even when you try to shake them loose. Jacob walked back to his counter and resumed sorting tobacco, but his movements were slower now, more thoughtful. Each leaf seemed to require careful consideration, as if the simple act of organizing inventory had become a meditation on more complex questions of order and justice. What would you want him to do? If you were me, I mean. What would justice look like? It was Madeline's turn to be quiet for a moment, watching Jacob's careful movements as he worked with one good hand to do a job that should have required two. The question he'd asked went to the heart of everything she'd been wrestling with since Billy Harkins walked into her office that morning. I think, she said finally, that justice might look like Billy Harkins spending the rest of his life making amends. Working to help the people he hurt, contributing to this community instead of just taking from it. Building something instead of just tearing it down. And if he runs, if he decides the weight of staying is too much and lights out for the territories. Madeline's smile was grim. Then I hunt him down and bring him back in chains. But I don't think he will. A man who carries guilt for 15 years and then comes back to face it isn't the running kind anymore. Jacob set down the tobacco and looked at her directly, his brown eyes holding a mixture of pain and something that might have been hope. I want to see him. Jacob, I'm not sure that's. I want to see him, Jacob repeated, his voice firm with the kind of resolve that had carried him through 15 years of physical limitation and emotional struggle. I've been carrying this anger for 15 years, Sheriff. If there's a chance to set it down, I need to take it. But I need to look him in the eye again first, see what kind of man he's become. Madeline nodded slowly. I'll arrange it. But Jacob, I want you to think about this carefully. Once you sit down with him, once you hear his story, you can't unknow it. Sometimes it's easier to hate a stranger than to forgive a human being. Maybe, Jacob said. But I'm tired of being angry. Tired of letting that one day 15 years ago define the rest of my life. If Billy Harkins is truly repentant, if he's willing to spend his remaining years making up for what he did, then maybe it's time for me to find out what forgiveness feels like. Madeline left the tobacco shop with a weight lifted from her shoulders she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. If Jacob Morrison could find it in his heart to at least consider forgiveness, then maybe there was hope for the rest of the town. But Jacob had always been the philosophical type, inclined toward turning the other cheek. Others might not be so generous. Her next stop was Eleanor Henley's small house on Elm Street, where Marcus Henley's widow had spent the last 15 years raising their 2 children alone and fighting to keep the small farm her husband had left her. The walk there took Madeline past the school, where she could hear Miss Adelaide's voice drifting through the open windows as she taught the afternoon arithmetic lesson. Eleanor answered the door with flour on her hands and worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when Madeline had first met her 5 years ago. At 38, she should have been in the prime of her life, but single motherhood and financial struggle had aged her like hard weather ages would, wearing away the softness until only the essential strength remained. "Sheriff Colby," Eleanor said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong?" "The children." "The children are fine," Madeline assured her quickly. "I'm sorry to bother you during your baking, but I have something important to discuss with you." "May I come in?" Eleanor stepped aside, and Madeline entered the small but spotlessly clean kitchen where the smell of fresh bread filled the air like a benediction. 2 loaves sat cooling on the windowsill, golden brown and perfect despite being baked by a woman who often had to choose between buying flour and buying shoes for her children. "Would you like some coffee?" Eleanor asked, already reaching for the pot that sat permanently on the back of the stove. "That would be kind, thank you." Madeline sat at the small wooden table that dominated the kitchen, noting the careful way Eleanor moved around her domain, making every motion count, wasting nothing. It was the economy of someone who'd learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. Eleanor poured 2 cups of coffee so black and strong it could wake the dead, then sat across from Madeline with her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic. The kitchen was quiet except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of children playing in the schoolyard. "Now then, what's this about?" Madeline took a sip of the coffee and felt it burn all the way down. Eleanor Henley might be struggling financially, but she hadn't lost her touch with chicory and determination. "Eleanor, one of the men responsible for your husband's death has returned to town." Eleanor's cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, coffee sloshing over the rim to stain the clean tablecloth. Her face went white, then red, then white again as the meaning of Madeline's words sank in like stones thrown into still water. "Which one?" she whispered. "Billy Harkins. He came to turn himself in, brought back all the stolen gold. Says he wants to make amends." Eleanor was quiet for so long that Madeline began to worry she'd gone into shock. Then, slowly, the widow's eyes filled with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks in silent streams. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with 15 years of suppressed emotion. "I prayed for this," Eleanor said. "Not for him to come back, exactly, but for some kind of justice. Some acknowledgement that Marcus didn't die for nothing, that his life mattered to someone besides his family." Madeline reached across the table and covered Eleanor's hand with her own. "Your husband's life mattered to this whole town. He was trying to help Jacob Morrison when he got shot. That was the kind of man he was, and people remember. But remembering doesn't pay for medicine when the children are sick," Eleanor said bitterly. "Remembering doesn't fix the roof or buy winter coats or keep the farm running when you're trying to do it all alone." The truth of those words hung heavy in the warm kitchen air. Madeline had seen Eleanor struggle, had watched her take in washing and mending to make ends meet, had noticed the careful way she portioned out food at church suppers to make sure her children ate their fill while she made do with whatever remained. "No, it doesn't," Madeline agreed. "But that gold might help with some of those things. $12,000, Eleanor. That's enough to set up a fund for the families who were hurt by what happened that day." Eleanor's eyes widened. 12,000? But that was 15 years ago. Surely he spent some of it. "Every piece is there. He says he never touched it, couldn't bring himself to profit from what they'd done." Madeline paused, watching Eleanor's face carefully. "The question now is what we do with it, and with him." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the small garden where she grew vegetables to supplement the children's diet. The autumn frost had killed most of the plants, leaving behind the stark brown stubble of another growing season ended. The sight seemed to mirror her own emotional landscape, barren now, but with the promise of renewal if spring ever came. What does he want? This Billy Harkins. To make amends. To work off his debt to this town in whatever way we'll allow him to. And if we don't allow him to? If we demand he hang for what he did? Madeline's voice was quiet when she answered. Then he'll hang. He came back knowing that was a possibility. He's not asking for mercy, Eleanor. He's asking for the chance to earn forgiveness through his actions. Eleanor turned back from the window, her eyes dry now but hard as winter frost. My children ask about their father sometimes. Sarah, she's 12 now, old enough to understand that he didn't just die of sickness or accident. Tommy's only 8, but he's starting to ask questions too. What do I tell them if I let their father's killer walk free? You tell them the truth, Madeline said simply. That their father died trying to help someone else, and that the man who killed him has spent 15 years trying to become worthy of forgiveness. You tell them that justice isn't always about punishment, sometimes it's about healing. Eleanor sat back down at the table, her movements careful and controlled. When she picked up her coffee cup, her hands were steady despite the emotion Madeline could see in her eyes. I want to see the gold first. Want to know it's real, that this isn't some kind of trick or cruel joke. Of course. I have it locked in my office safe. You can come by any time. And I want to know what he plans to do. Not just pretty words about making amends, but real plans. How does he intend to help the families he hurt? How does he plan to contribute to this community? Madeline nodded. Those are fair questions. I'll make sure you get answers. Eleanor picked up her coffee cup with steady hands and took a long sip. Sheriff, if that gold can help my children have a better life, if it can ease the burden on Jacob Morrison and the other families that were hurt, then maybe some good can come from this tragedy after all. And Billy Harkins? Eleanor's smile was sad but not bitter. If he's truly repentant, if he's willing to spend the rest of his life making up for what he did, then who am I to stand in the way of redemption? Marcus always said that hate was a poison we drink hoping it will hurt our enemies. I don't want to poison my children with my bitterness. Madeline left Eleanor's house feeling cautiously optimistic. 2 down, and both had surprised her with their willingness to consider alternatives to simple vengeance. But she knew the real test would come when word spread through the town, as it inevitably would. Small towns had a way of amplifying emotions, and fear and anger could spread faster than wildfire when people felt threatened. Her final stop of the day was the bank itself, where President Theodore Carstairs had been struggling for years to restore community confidence after the robbery. Theodore was a small, nervous man who'd inherited the position from his father and lived in constant fear of another catastrophe befalling his institution. The bank was a solid brick building on the corner of Main and Cedar, its heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron bands after the robbery. Theodore had installed new locks, hired guards during business hours, and taken every precaution possible to prevent another theft, but Madeline knew the measures were as much for his own peace of mind as for actual security. She found him in his office, bent over ledgers with the intense concentration of a man trying to make numbers add up to more than they were. When she knocked on his doorframe, he looked up with the startled expression of someone perpetually expecting bad news. "Sheriff Colby," he said, half rising from his chair. "Please, come in. Is there some trouble?" Madeline took the chair across from his desk, noting the way his hands trembled slightly as he set down his pen. Theodore Carstairs was not a man who bore adversity well, and the bank robbery had left him a nervous wreck who jumped at every unusual sound and saw potential threats in every stranger who entered his establishment. "Theodore, I have news that's going to be difficult to hear, but I think in the long run it might be good news for you and the bank." Theodore's face went pale. "Oh God, not another robbery. I've been having nightmares about—" No robbery," Madeline said quickly. "Theodore, Billy Harkins came back to town today. He brought all the stolen gold with him and turned himself in." Theodore stared at her for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then, without warning, he burst into tears, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions held in check for too long. Madeline waited patiently while he composed himself, understanding that sometimes good news could be as overwhelming as bad. When Theodore finally looked up, his eyes were red but clearer than she'd seen them in years. "All of it," he whispered. "He brought back all the gold?" "Every piece, as far as I can tell. $12,000, just like it says in the old reports." Theodore's laugh was shaky but genuine. "Do you know what this means, Sheriff? For 15 years, I've been operating this bank under a cloud of suspicion. People wondering if maybe there was inside help, if maybe I knew something about the robbery I wasn't telling. This clears my family's name once and for all." Madeline hadn't considered that angle, but she could see how the robbery might have cast suspicion on the bank's management, especially in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The weight of that suspicion must have been crushing for a man like Theodore, who valued his reputation above almost everything else. "What do you want to do about Billy Harkins, Theodore? He's here, he's admitted his guilt, and he's asking for the chance to make amends." Theodore wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and sat up straighter in his chair, looking more confident than Madeline had ever seen him. "I want to see him face to face. I want to look him in the eye and hear him admit what he did. And then—" He paused, considering. "Then I want to see him work every day for the rest of his life to make up for the damage he caused. Not hanging. Not prison." Theodore shook his head firmly. "What good would that do? Dead men don't pay debts, Sheriff. Prison's just another burden on the taxpayers. But a man working honestly, contributing to the community, helping the families he hurt? That's justice that actually means something." As Madeline walked back toward her office in the gathering dusk, she reflected on the day's conversations. 3 people directly affected by the robbery, 3 people willing to consider forgiveness over vengeance. It was more than she dared hope for. But she also knew that not everyone in Cedar Creek would be so generous, and the real test would come when the news spread and the whole community had to decide what kind of justice they wanted to pursue. The autumn evening was crisp and clear, with the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout the town as families gathered for their evening meals, the ordinary rhythms of frontier life continuing despite the extraordinary circumstances that had unfolded that day. Tomorrow, Madeline knew, would bring new challenges. Word would spread, emotions would run high, and she'd have to navigate the treacherous waters between justice and vengeance, between the demands of the law and the needs of the community. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, Cedar Creek might find a way to heal old wounds instead of tearing them open again. By the next morning, the whole town knew. Madeline could see it in the way conversations stopped when she walked by, in the nervous glances toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, in the clusters of men gathering outside Patterson's general store with a particular intensity that preceded either a barn raising or a lynching. Word had spread through Cedar Creek like wildfire through dry grass, carried by the inevitable network of gossip and speculation that connected every household in the small frontier community. Madeline had expected this, but the speed of it still surprised her. She'd barely finished her morning coffee when the first delegation appeared at her office door. Pete Williams led the group, his blacksmith's arms crossed over his broad chest and his face set in hard lines. Behind him stood his son Danny, along with Tom Miller, Frank Patterson, and half a dozen other men whose expressions ranged from angry to suspicious to downright hostile. "Sheriff," Pete said without preamble, "we hear tell you got Billy Harkins sitting pretty at Henderson's place instead of locked up where he belongs." Madeline set down her coffee cup and leaned back in her chair, taking the measure of the men crowding into her office. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it during a sleepless night spent weighing options and consequences. "That's right," she said simply. "He turned himself involuntarily, brought back all the stolen gold, and I'm considering alternatives to immediate incarceration." Alternatives. Danny Williams stepped forward, his young face flushed with inherited anger. "Sheriff, that man killed Doc Henley and crippled Jacob Morrison. Ain't no alternative to hanging for crimes like that. Madeline stood slowly, her hand resting casually near her gun belt, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the authority she represented. Dr. Henley died 15 years ago, Danny. You were barely old enough to remember him. And Jacob Morrison's got his own thoughts about what justice should look like. Jacob's always been soft, Frank Patterson interjected. Too much book learning, not enough backbone. But the rest of us ain't forgot what that gang did to this town. Nobody's asking you to forget, Madeline said firmly. But I am asking you to think about what serves this community best. Billy Harkins is not going anywhere, I've got his word on that, and a man who carries guilt for 15 years before coming back to face it isn't likely to run now. Pete Williams' laugh was harsh. His word? Sheriff, the man's a bank robber and a killer. What's his word worth? More than you might think, Madeline replied. But if you don't trust his word, trust mine. If Billy Harkins so much as looks sideways at running, I'll hunt him down and bring him back in chains. You have my guarantee on that. The men exchanged glances, their anger temporarily tempered by Madeline's calm confidence. She'd built a reputation for competence and fairness during her 8 years as sheriff, and even the most hot-headed among them respected her judgment, even when they disagreed with it. What exactly are you proposing, Sheriff? Tom Miller asked, his voice more reasonable than the others. What does this alternative justice look like? Madeline walked to her safe and withdrew the leather saddlebag, placing it on her desk where the men could see it. The weight of it made the wood creak slightly, a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet office. $12,000 in gold, she said, opening the bag to reveal its contents. Every piece of what was stolen 15 years ago. Billy Harkins carried this burden for a decade and a half, never spent so much as a coin of it, and now he's brought it back to make amends. The sight of the gold had a visible effect on the men. Pete Williams' aggressive posture softened slightly, and even Danny's righteous anger seemed to waver as he stared at the fortune lying before them. That's a powerful lot of money, Frank Patterson said quietly. Enough to make real differences in people's lives, Madeline agreed. Jacob Morrison could get proper medical treatment for his arm. Eleanor Henley could fix her farm and provide for her children. The school could get new books, the church could repair its roof, and we could set up a fund to help other families facing hard times. Blood money, Danny Williams said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Maybe, Madeline said. But blood money that could do a lot of good for people who've been suffering for 15 years. The question is whether we let pride and anger keep us from helping our neighbors, or whether we find a way to turn past tragedy into present healing. Pete Williams stepped closer to the desk, his experienced eyes taking in the gold with the assessment of a man who knew the value of honest labor. What would he do? This Billy Harkins? If we don't hang him, what's he contribute besides this gold? That would be up to the community to decide, Madeline said. He's got skills, carpentry, ranching, general labor. He could work on public projects, help families in need, contribute his labor to the common good. Think of it as a lifetime of making amends instead of a few minutes at the end of a rope. The men were quiet for a long moment, the weight of decision settling over them like morning mist. Madeline could see them wrestling with conflicting emotions, the desire for vengeance warring with practical consideration of what would actually benefit their community. I want to hear it from him, Pete Williams said finally. Want to look him in the eye and hear him admit what he done. If he's truly repentant, if he's willing to spend his life making up for it, then maybe we can consider your alternative. Madeline nodded. That can be arranged. But I want it done proper. No lynch mob, no vigilante justice. We do this according to law and order, with the whole community having a say. Town meeting. Tom Miller suggested. Town meeting, Madeline agreed. Tomorrow evening at the church. Give folks time to think about it, talk it over with their families. This is too important a decision to make in anger. The delegation filed out of her office with considerably less bluster than they'd entered with, the sight of the gold and Madeline's calm reasoning having tempered their immediate fury. But she knew the real test was yet to come. A town meeting would bring out all opinions, from the most forgiving to the most vengeful, and she'd have to trust in the collective wisdom of a community that had learned to survive through cooperation and mutual aid. Billy Harkins spent that day splitting wood behind Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, his axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm that drew curious stares from passers-by. The honest work felt good after years of carrying guilt like a stone in his chest, each swing of the axe a small step toward the redemption he'd traveled so far to seek. Mrs. Henderson, a practical woman in her 60s who'd seen her share of hardship and redemption, brought him coffee at midday and sat with him on the back porch while he rested. "Folks are talking," she said without preamble. "I figured they would be," Billy replied, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. "Can't say I blame them. Some are angry," she continued. "Some are curious. Some are hopeful. That's the way of things in a place like this. Folks got different ideas about justice and forgiveness." Billy nodded, understanding that Mrs. Henderson was offering more than just observation. She was giving him the lay of the land, helping him understand what he'd be facing in the days to come. "What do you think, ma'am? You've lived here longer than most. You got a sense of how this might go." Mrs. Henderson sipped her coffee thoughtfully, her weathered hands wrapped around the warm cup. "I think," she said finally, "that this town's seen enough tragedy to know the difference between justice and revenge. But it's going to take some convincing, and it's going to take you proving yourself with more than just words." That evening, Madeline made her rounds through town, stopping at homes and businesses to ensure that word of the town meeting had spread properly. She found the community divided, as she'd expected, but she also found something else, a willingness to listen, to consider alternatives, that gave her hope for a peaceful resolution. At the Morrison household, she found Jacob sitting by his fireplace, his damaged arm resting on his lap as he read from the family Bible. His wife Sarah had been gone 3 years now, another victim of the frontier's harsh demands, but Jacob had maintained their home with the same careful attention he'd once given to bank records. "Jacob," Madeline said as he welcomed her in, "tomorrow's meeting's going to be important. People respect your opinion, and whatever you say will carry weight." Jacob closed the Bible carefully, his finger marking his place. "I've been thinking about that all day, Sheriff. About what I want to say, what kind of man I want to be remembered as." And Jacob's smile was peaceful, the expression of a man who'd found resolution after years of struggle. "I want to be remembered as someone who chose healing over hatred. If Billy Harkins is truly repentant, if he's willing to spend his remaining years making amends, then I'm willing to forgive. Not for his sake, but for mine." Madeline felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Jacob Morrison's forgiveness would go a long way toward swaying public opinion, particularly among the older residents who remembered him as a respected member of the community. Her next stop was Eleanor Henley's small farmhouse, where she found the widow putting her children to bed. Sarah, now 12, and Tommy, 8, were bright children who'd inherited their father's gentle nature and their mother's strength. They greeted Madeline with shy smiles before disappearing into their bedroom under their mother's watchful eye. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Madeline asked as Eleanor poured tea in her spotlessly clean kitchen. "Nervous," Eleanor admitted. "But hopeful too. If that gold can help my children have a better life, if it can ease the burden on other families, then maybe some good can come from Marcus's death after all." "And if the town decides against it? If they choose hanging over redemption?" Eleanor's hands were steady as she served the tea. "Then that's the community's choice to make. But I'll speak my piece tomorrow, tell folks that my husband would have wanted mercy over vengeance. Marcus always believed in second chances." The next evening, the church was packed beyond capacity, with latecomers standing in the aisles and spilling out onto the front steps. Madeline had never seen the building so full, not even for Christmas services or harvest festivals. The whole community had turned out, farmers and merchants, widows and bachelors, children old enough to understand and grandparents who remembered when justice was dispensed by whoever had the fastest gun. Reverend Phillips opened the meeting with a prayer for wisdom and guidance, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. Then Madeline stood to address the community, feeling the weight of history and responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle. "Folks," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "we're here tonight to decide what kind of justice Cedar Creek wants to pursue. 15 years ago, this community suffered a great tragedy. Good men died, families were torn apart, and our sense of security was shattered. Now one of the men responsible has returned, seeking not escape but redemption." She gestured toward the back of the church, where Billy Harkins sat with his hat in his hands, his weathered face pale but determined. "Billy Harkins has brought back every piece of the stolen gold and offered to spend the rest of his life making amends for his crimes. The question before us tonight is whether we choose vengeance or healing, punishment or restoration." The debate that followed was passionate but civil, with voices raised on both sides of the question. Pete Williams spoke for those demanding traditional justice, his arguments rooted in the belief that some crimes could only be answered with blood. Danny Williams echoed his father's position, his young voice shaking with inherited anger. But other voices rose as well. Jacob Morrison stood slowly, his damaged arm visible to all as he spoke of forgiveness and the poison of perpetual hatred. Eleanor Henley followed, her quiet dignity lending weight to her words about mercy and second chances. Theodore Carstairs spoke of restoration and community healing, his banker's practical mind focused on the tangible benefits that could flow from Billy's gold and labor. When Billy finally stood to address the community, the church fell silent. His voice was rough with emotion as he recounted his crimes, admitted his guilt, and asked not for mercy but for the chance to earn forgiveness through his actions. "I can't bring back Dr. Henley," he said, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I can't fix Jacob Morrison's arm or give Eleanor Henley back her husband. But I can work every day for the rest of my life to help this community heal from the wounds I helped inflict. I can use my hands to build instead of destroy, to help instead of harm." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Madeline had hoped but decisive enough to provide legitimacy. By a margin of 63 to 47, the community of Cedar Creek chose restoration over retribution, healing over hanging. Billy Harkins would live, but he would live as a servant to the community he'd wronged. The gold would be distributed to help those most affected by the robbery, and Billy would work under Madeline's supervision on projects that benefited the common good. It wasn't traditional justice, but it was justice nonetheless, a recognition that sometimes healing served the community better than punishment. As winter settled over Cedar Creek, Billy Harkins began his new life of atonement. He repaired Eleanor Henley's farmhouse roof and built her children a new barn. He constructed wheelchair ramps for Jacob Morrison's tobacco shop and helped other disabled veterans of frontier violence. He worked on the school, the church, and public buildings, his skilled hands guided by a desire to build something lasting and good. The gold was distributed according to community decision: medical care for Jacob Morrison, financial security for Eleanor Henley's children, improvements to the school and church, and a fund to help other families facing hard times. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was enough to build a better future. Madeline watched it all with satisfaction, knowing that her gamble on redemption over revenge had paid dividends far beyond what she'd imagined. Cedar Creek had chosen the harder path, the one that required faith in human capacity for change and growth, and the community had emerged stronger for it. Billy aged quickly in those final years, his body worn out by decades of hard living and harder guilt, but his spirit seemed to grow lighter with each act of service. He never married again, dedicating himself entirely to the work of atonement, but he found peace in the relationships he built with the people he'd once wronged. When Jacob Morrison shook his hand with genuine warmth, when Eleanor Henley's children called him Uncle Billy, when the community gathered to dedicate the new schoolhouse he'd helped build, Billy Harkins finally understood what redemption looked like. It wasn't the dramatic gesture of returning stolen gold, though that had been necessary. It was the daily choice to serve others, to build instead of destroy, to spend one's remaining years proving that people could change. Madeline stood in the cemetery on a cold spring morning 3 years later, watching as the community she'd helped heal gathered to bury the man who'd once been their enemy and had become their neighbor. Billy Harkins had died in his sleep, worn out by honest labor and peaceful conscience, and the turnout for his funeral spoke to the transformation both he and the town had undergone. Jacob Morrison spoke at the service, his words simple and profound. Billy Harkins came back to us carrying the burden of old sins, he said. He leaves us having shown that no man is beyond redemption if he's willing to do the work of earning it. Eleanor Henley placed a simple wooden cross on the grave, carved by Billy's own hands during his final illness. Theodore Carstairs read from the Bible about forgiveness and second chances. The children Billy had taught to read and write scattered wildflowers on the fresh earth. As the crowd dispersed, Madeline remained behind with Mrs. Henderson, the two women standing in comfortable silence beside the grave of a man who'd proven that justice could take many forms. "Think he found what he was looking for?" Mrs. Henderson asked. Madeline nodded, watching the spring wind scatter petals across the cemetery like blessings. "I think he found something better. He found out that a man can change, that a community can heal, and that sometimes the hardest justice is the kind that serves everyone instead of just satisfying anger." The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold that reminded Madeline of the morning Billy Harkins had walked into her office with his burden of stolen treasure and genuine repentance. Cedar Creek had chosen the harder path that day, the one that required faith and forgiveness and the belief that people could change. Looking back, Madeline knew it had been the right choice. The gold was long since distributed, the wounds long since healed, but the lesson remained. Sometimes justice meant building bridges instead of walls, creating futures instead of just punishing pasts. Billy Harkins had given them that gift in the end, not just the return of stolen gold, but the proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of earning it. The wind picked up as Madeline and Mrs. Henderson walked back toward town, carrying with it the scent of spring flowers and new beginnings. Behind them, Billy Harkins rested in the peace he'd worked 3 years to earn, while ahead of them Cedar Creek continued its life as a community that had learned the difference between revenge and justice, between punishment and healing. It was a lesson worth remembering, Madeline thought as she looked toward the future with hope and satisfaction. In a world too often dominated by anger and retribution, Cedar Creek had chosen a different way, the way of redemption, forgiveness, and the patient work of building something better from the ashes of old pain. It was, she reflected, the most important lesson any community could learn.